One of the more interesting games of the community series to watch was the North Melbourne Kangaroos taking on the West Coast Eagles. A plethora of value options, both in the mid-range and through the cash cows, and a couple of top price premium roos that we've been debating all pre-season. Is it worth it? Did we get our answers, or is there more questions than we had before this game? We are going to unpack the Roos and the Eagles in the Community Series match and what it means for your AFL Fantasy SuperCoach and Dream Team Classic sides, and also hopefully help find you some late round value on the Keeper platform if you are drafting very, very soon. Hey, it's MJ from the Coaches Panel. I do hope you're enjoying this series, as well as the fact that every single day here on the channel we have been dropping an episode a day throughout your fantasy footy preseason, getting real close to opening round, let alone round one. We always have to start these match reviews looking at the players that have missed. We dropped an episode on the channel about a week or so ago now, looking at one of the key rules to identifying and not getting tricked and trapped in the decisions from what happens in these matches, is to remind ourselves of the players that are missing who are likely to be there in round one, so you don't overreact and ultimately set yourself back with a forced trade because you just got sucked in to something that wasn't really real. That said, there's a couple of players that were missing that probably would sit best 22. Two of them that are interesting from a mid-forward perspective for North Melbourne. I'm talking about Jai Simpkin and Luke Parker. Both look likely to be ready to go for round one. How does that affect the midfield rotation? Will be something we do need to consider. While the other two players that are fantasy relevant, one is a bit more longer term out, but also plays for Kangaroos, which is George Wardlaw. I think the midfield combination is much more intriguing with him missing. And then for the Eagles, I think the only player that's of fantasy note and relevance that's probably in this best 22, should he be fit, is Elijah Hewitt. But unfortunately for him, got hurt about a week ago now in a lower tier levels practice game. Now is very much touch and go for round one. That is not promising signs. Right, where do we start? We have to start with Harry Sheezel, in my eyes. He was one of the best North Melbourne players in this game. Plenty of midfield presence too, about 2/3 of the game, 67% if you want to be exact, centre bounce presence. And then he had these interesting moments in the game where he'd start forward and then move up to become the fourth option at stoppage through the midfield. And then there were times where he'd just drift back and would happily just get the ball at his own free will. Plenty of football his way, 36 touches, 6 marks, 3 tackles and a goal. Here is what I can tell you about Harry Sheezel. He has the license to roam without any doubt in my mind. He could just go anywhere he wants. And to go with that, he just is such a smart IQ footballer. He just gets into damaging spaces as well. Good luck going against Harry Sheezel because, wow, he is phenomenal. The challenge with fading Harry as opposed to the challenge to starting him, it is really complex because if you start with Harry, it drastically impacts what you can do in the other lines. I know a lot of coaches are really looking for this anchor D1, whether it be Sicily, whether it be Sheezel, whether it be Zorko, whether it be Nazaya Wanganeen Millera. We're all looking to find who's that guy, because I am understanding the hesitancy of Short, Rivers, these sort of blokes as your D1. Harry's expensive, but I don't forecast with this role him drastically falling his scoring off a cliff. Now, we do need to consider the opposition, and we do need to consider that it was a low stoppage game. Those two factors do need to sit in there, but it is indicative of what we saw in Harry Sheezel late last year, which is a little bit forward of the ball. He gets about a goal a game, but 2/3 of his game to 3/4 is sitting through the midfield, and with that, he's got that permission to roam freely. He's such a high IQ footballer. He's one of the smartest players in the league already. He's got high athleticism, high endurance, high turner speed, and high skill. There's just not a thing that he is bad at. Is he going to get the tag? Well, on this channel about a week ago, myself and Dylan Alexander did an episode that was unpacking all these variable elements around North Melbourne, because I think they're the most relevant and interesting team this season, because there's so many players that we are considering from a fantasy football perspective. I'm not even going to be able to cover them right throughout this episode. Go back and check out that video, that audio podcast. It's got in more detail. Here's what I'll say to you. Over these final few days before opening round commences, I would have a look at what your team looks like with Sheezel at D1 and what your side looks like without him, knowing you don't want to run too long in the season without him, because I don't forecast, well, you'll probably get him cheaper in rounds 3, 4, 5. Do you have the pathway, and have you generated the cash required to be able to maximize getting him at that likely bottomed out price, where I can only really see him, barring an injury, dropping maybe no more than 50,000 in SuperCoach, maybe no more than 100,000 in AFL Fantasy. And that's if things don't go to script, because I just see him as this perennial 110, 115 guy across the formats. He's just such a good footballer. Do you have to start Harry? Absolutely not. Do you have to fade him? Absolutely not. What I'll say this sounds like a real sit on the fence type comment, but I'll put it out there for you anyway. I do not think fading or starting Harry Sheezel will be the defining factor in your season. I'm just not convinced that is the case. I don't forecast a cliff. I do not forecast massive value to come by fading him. Therefore, this is not a season-defining selection. And so it's important because he is a captaincy consideration early days, but I wouldn't lose sleep about it. Yes, he's someone we want to have early in the season. Building that into our starting squad does make a lot of sense, but it is hard to replicate that entirety of season. Check the fixture, see if you can make it work. As I said, I'd be looking after these whole community series anyway, just cleaning slate with your team, rebuilding it, and I would try a rebuild with him at 1 and then him without in your side, and just see which feels much more full for you and which feels like a great and true north. Because having Sheezel is going to hurt the rest of your structure, but it might be more painful to go without him. That's my take on Harry Sheezel. It is a decision for you. I don't think it defines your season one way or the other. Tristan Xerri. Absolute phenomenal in this game. Just tackles for days from Tristan Xerri. 14 tackles, 34 hit-outs, attended 79% of the ruck contests, a handful of frees for and against either way, 16 possessions for him in this matchup. Gosh, he's going to be good. That is without question. But let's put into consideration who he was rucking against. It was Reid, Williams, and Flynn. Up until 24 hours ago, no one was even considering Matt Flynn again. We put him on the fantasy radar at the start of the preseason in the first week of January. There's a little bit of love for him then, and then it's just dried up. Now it's come back because, you pop a SuperCoach ton and everyone's interested in you all of a sudden. But the reality is, Flynn, Williams, Reid, these are not the apex, the pinnacle of rucks in the AFL. And so we do need to put a consideration into who he's playing against. That said, this is exactly what Tristan Xerri is. It builds such an incredible high score basement of tackles that no other ruckman can compete with. Then sits around that kind of normative range of what a ruckman does as their base. His base is the tackle. So he's already margins ahead of anybody else. And I do think the improvement in this North Melbourne midfield from a SuperCoach perspective means that hit out to advantage can only become an even greater factor for you. The only thing I'll say, and I've said it now a few times throughout this preseason, I did dub him the most relevant player in my top 50 most relevant countdown to start the year. Go back and check out that episode without running over too much ground. I'm fading Tristan despite the high ownership and the high scoring pedigree. For me, I do look at that starting fixture. That looks tough. And I think it's harder to replicate. And I really love some value options that have popped along for us throughout this week and the weeks prior to it. So yes, happy if you're a Xerri owner, go with goodness because he's going to be fantastic. I think there'll be a little bit of a drop, much like Sheezel. Again, I'm not too sure it's going to be the defining selection in victory or in failure this year. But gosh, he's an expensive brother. It ain't going to come easy. It does really hurt the rest of what you can do. If you're looking for value and upside, I'd argue Xerri is not that guy. But he's proven us wrong a few times. Let's see what he can do. Do comment if you're watching this as a YouTube episode. Comment below. Are you starting Tristan Xerri or not? I think it's the biggest and most important decision you should make, not just because of what he does, but as I said, it probably impacts the structure of so many other variables. Colby McKercher, we were kind of intrigued to see and watch who and how this ball movement would kind of happen for us under this new regime of Clarko, with Fisher's kind of fallen out of love. They've moved Sheezel up the ground. We know Caleb Daniels got that spot. We'll talk about him in a moment. But we wanted to see how much exclusivity of the wing did McKercher have, and then whether or not that could still keep him in relevance as a defensive listed player. Unfortunately, he's kind of sitting on the wing and even a little bit through that forward line at times. It just means while I don't see him drastically falling away from what he's priced at, he's such a smart player. He does get into good spaces, and the way North moved the ball, he does feel like the kind of guy that a Caleb Daniel kick out of defence would find him in some open territory as they try to transition and open up the ground a little bit for them. I just don't see that drastic upside that should he have stayed as one of the playmakers off halfback we might have seen. It does seem like they want his ball use in the forward half of the ground and coming into forward 50, not just getting them out of jail. So for that, Colby, great player, absolute star of the future, definitely a great option in your keeper and dynasty leagues. But for Classic this year, I'd rather trade into him on the run if he does go back without us foreseeing that, rather than starting with him and parachuting off to one of these guys. I'd rather he be the outlet rather than using him as the parachute that I need to jump off. Plain and simple, if you're not on Caleb Daniel, uppercut. Your team, not yourself, not promoting that. Just absolute undeniable value. Mid-forward by position, but playing as that playmaker across halfback. They're just funneling that ball through him absolutely constantly. The kick-ins are flying through him. He is just the one that has got that space. We have talked about throughout this community series review of these forwards that have emerged, whether it be at the top end of the Rankins and the Horne-Francises, or at the bottom end, the likes of Davidson and Stone that have emerged for us, let alone what's in this middle pocket. If you're fading anybody in this forward line, I'd almost say pick another person over Daniel. Almost every other player, I would say, fade them over Daniel. He's got undeniable value. He's got a clear role. And through watching this game, there is nobody else that North Melbourne trust to have the skill set to move the ball off halfback. Absolutely plain and simple. Pick Caleb Daniel. Last couple of roos I do want to talk about before we wrap up the episode. No, I'm just kidding. We got to get to the Eagles, don't we? Finn O'Sullivan. I thought a lot of people had moved off him and cooled on him, and understandably so. We hear about an undeniable talent that's a real impact per possession type of player. Again, hearing Dylan Alexander speak on this channel about him just over a week ago on our episode about North Melbourne made me go, oh, doesn't seem like a whole volume of accumulation here. Maybe more a SuperCoach guy than a fantasy guy. But that's it. I loved what I saw from Finn O'Sullivan. No centre bounces in this game. They were pretty tight. It was Xerri, it was Powell, it was Phillips, it was Sheezel, it was LDU. And then surprisingly, a little bit of Jack Darling. If you're looking for a little bit of relief through there, he's the guy that was kind of coming in as the second chop option. I just wonder, we talk about a couple of players that are missing in this team with Simpkin and Parker. While not playing in that wing, I did see at times O'Sullivan just kind of drift into different pockets of the game, including spending some time forward of the ball. Not really as a small forward, but certainly not playing as a marking forward. And so I think I'd put it this way. if your salary cap allows you the space to have O'Sullivan as a bench option in your side, I actually really quite like it. He's got job security for days, and he's shown he does have some scoring pedigree about him, not just at junior territories, but now in this one community series game. So if it's not breaking the bank, I wouldn't force your structure and drop off a premium or a mid-pricer to get him. But if your structure allows you to get your hands on O'Sullivan, I'd actually be pretty comfortable with it. He looked good with ball in hand. He adds some extra skill and poise, and he just doesn't make a wrong decision at all. I think he's an absolute weapon. He's just not going to be a high accumulator. That's all I'd say. Tom Powell is the man that I keep hearing about just having a phenomenal preseason out of North Melbourne. And he's probably one of the more intriguing players to consider about whether or not we get him in our starting squads in Classic. Because in draft, you just bump him up a round or two in your rankings, because with no George Wardlaw, he does have this role. Without any question in my mind, he does have this role. Some would have some thoughts that a Parker and or a Simpkin coming back for round one might hurt him a little bit. But to me, I think it's probably more likely a Will Phillips type that probably gets hurt a little bit more. Yes, he offers something defensively that these other players don't, but I like what Powell can offer because he does do the defensive stuff. He is an accumulator and he does get the contested stuff, and he adds a bit of difference to what Sheezel and also what LDU provide. So I like him. The challenge in a Classic environment for SuperCoach, Fantasy and Dream Team is in his price range. You've got guys that are the number one, the number two, gosh, even the top three mid. And they offer something that's super different, where they're either a proven commodity of a 105, 110 guy minimum across the formats, or someone that has been kind of historically shown they can go on runs of 110, 120 plus for 2, 3, 4 months when their body allows them to, let alone guys that are cheaper, 100,000 or so, that probably could match his scoring power. So I think we'll see Powell get faded in a lot of teams, and that's a victim of circumstance of so many value options in this midfield this year. But I'd absolutely keep him on my parachute list as someone that I can use as my outlet. If my Dylan Shield, if my Peatling, if my Chera, if my whoever in that range doesn't pop, and he does in round one, I'd actually consider him as someone to fly into, but I couldn't start him with all good conscience. Look, LDU was fine really quickly on him. I just can't see you starting him in Fantasy and in SuperCoach. Again, so much better value beneath him and so much more proven commodities. Yes, he can get it done for 2, 3, 4 week stretches, but politely, I just don't see that being the guy you force separation into your team. So I'd absolutely look elsewhere other than that. From a West Coast Eagles perspective, look, you could probably put Tim Kelly up your draft boards a little bit more. He does look good. It is the guy playing as the one wood option. But from a centre bounce presence and for fantasy, I know there's been some intrigue in Jack Graham. At the start of the match, Minnie McWalter was really clear that they were running a pretty tight midfield. They said it'd be Reid, it'd be Duggan, it'd be Kelly, it'd be Graham. Based on the centre bounce data we got, that was absolutely what we saw. Now, when Elliot Yeo comes back, I do expect him to come into this mix, whether it be at the expense of one of them or they just split it out a little bit more. We'll have to wait and see during the season. But you could probably bump Tim up the radar of your draft board, maybe a round or two, but it's certainly not someone to do. But Jack Graham, look's got forward eligibility, so that probably sits in his favour a little bit. The role was there for him, but unfortunately, it's like what we've seen at Richmond as well, which was there's just not a fantasy game here for Jack Graham, and we do not need to shop in this territory anymore and take the risk with him. To be a broken record just for a second, maybe this is because it's the first time you're watching or tuning into a Coaches Panel podcast, you're not sure what this broken record is. I just want to highlight these forwards have all emerged for us this week alone. Isaac Rankin showed us he is a predominant mid, and we know that he is a near 100, if not higher than 100 average guy when he's got that role. Horn Francis could not have done any more. He was absolutely explosive. Yes, against a very poor St Kilda, but dynamic and still just dominated the game. And Port have an unbelievable early run. Those are two top-end premium mids that people maybe are only interested in one, now trying to force their way into two. All the variables have gone against the Bulldogs that Riley Sanders almost becomes the number one mid outside of a Tom Liberatore. Can you really afford to go against that? Jackson Macrae was exactly what we expected. Go back and check out my review of him on this channel as well. But can you really afford to fade that? Can you really afford to fade against a Caleb Daniel? I just think I'd almost fade all those other guys ahead of a Caleb Daniel. Then you've got the rookies. Davidson was amazing. Stone, I thought, was really, really solid. Kako, brilliant. Yes, got a lot of goals, but brilliant nonetheless. I haven't even hit everybody that could sit in this pocket of space yet, because I haven't even mentioned Bailey Smith, who didn't play this week. Come on, friend. You just don't need Jack Graham. The role is great, but the scoring is not. Just fade it. Just let it go. It's not going to happen. It's not going to help you. Liam Baker, look, probably in the similar vein. He does have that halfback spot, and they did look to bring him in to the game. But the reality is I have just listed, I think it was 8, 9 forwards. It's more than that. It's 10 forwards to fit into 8 spots, because I didn't even mention Hugo Garcia. Can you really choose Baker over these guys? Yeah, the role is there, but Mini hasn't given us much, and we've only seen a little bit to think that there's a high volume of accumulation there. There was plenty of ball back there, and while he scored okay, just not sold that there's going to be a high uncontested possession rate and lots of transition points for him back there. So with the volume of names that have popped over this week, I'll go elsewhere. Sorry, Liam, it's not you, it's them. Liam Duggan, I know some people are intrigued about what he might offer for us this pre-season. Yes, he's got that midfield role, but in that defensive line, some others in that similar price range, if not lower, have really popped for us, let alone the guys that are that 100,000 or so more than him that I've got greater trust in scoring in. He does seem to score okay, at least under Adam Simpson last year. He scored okay in the midfield. But in this system, I do feel like this midfield is still missing a piece. Now, maybe an Elliot Yeo will help fix that, but Kelly and Reid, they needed Jack Graham to offer that big body as a defensive option through there. I think Yeo will support that a little bit. I just feel like the archetype of this midfield isn't quite sitting right for me. They do need to go back to the draft. Gosh, they would have loved a Jagger Smith type in this combination of side. Just don't like the look and feel of him in there. He did float back as the game went on, but to me, I just want no piece of Liam Duggan. I'd rather trade into him once I get a little bit more information about what the Eagles look like. Look, it'd be a disservice not to talk about Matt Flynn. We did put him on the fantasy radar way back at the start of the preseason in the 50 most relevant. There were question marks all preseason about who was going to get this number one ruck role. And I think there's two really important things that have sat as a result of this. Number one, Matt Flynn is on the radar still in SuperCoach. Showed that while he wasn't the only and exclusive ruck, he was the predominant option through there, and he more than held his own in and around the ground and a contest. Yet Xerri had the best of him, but he's going to do that to a lot of ruckmen. I thought he was more than serviceable. In AFL Fantasy, look at his price point. I just don't think he's the right guy for you. Aren't happy to get two of the bigger end options. I'd almost look to go down to Reedy should he perform okay in his community series match. But to me, in AFL Fantasy, he's not a play. But SuperCoach and Dream Team, he does open up an option. More SuperCoach favourable than Dream Team, but that flex does just give you some other options. Look, he's priced, for example, in SuperCoach in and around that space of Hugo Garcia. I think he's got a greater pathway to scoring ton for you in SuperCoach should he have this number one ruck role, which I think he does. I know there's been some uncertainty about how the Eagles will structure it with their rucks and what they'll do with their tall forwards, but to me, I'm pretty certain that Flynn's done enough to at least get first crack at it. The other Eagle we should talk about before we do hit the cash cows is Archer Reid. lock him in for round 1. It might be injury that's created the opportunity, but as far as I'm concerned, he looks to be the second ruck option. Has he gone past a Bailey Williams? That's probably a bit of a stretch, but I think he's got that opportunity. As a ruck forward, his DPP, I think he's going to play early. He's not a bad shout to sit at R3, your utility, or even your flex position, depending on the format you play. The Eagles have given us a couple of ruck options, which I like, because politely, there's not much else about the Eagles we want to touch on, despite them having a couple of cash cows. To wrap up the episode, we probably should talk about the 2 West Coast Eagle cash cows that we've been considering. Jack Hutchinson, midfield eligible, has probably spent some time at the lower levels in the state system as a forward, but has shown he's got some skill and some craft to add to the wings that are a little bit thin for options for West Coast at the moment. But look, drifted back a little bit, did some good hard work and hard running stuff. But when I'm looking at these midfield rookies that have popped for us this year, Ashcroft could not have done any better. Finn O'Sullivan has really emerged this week. Nevitt has been excellent. We haven't even seen what Nathan O'Driscoll is going to do this week. A Lucas Camporelli. Like, there's more and more. We haven't seen Langford or Lindsay. I just don't think we need a Hutchinson. I think his job security looks pretty solid for what it's worth. I'm just not too sure the scoring is going to be there. Wingman, at the best of times, can just get lost in a game, just based on how the game and the ball movement is and what their instructions are of a coach to sit and to do and to create. I just don't trust an Eagles wingman to get me that 65 every week. And at this price point, in contrast to what other mid-rookies are going to do, yeah, not interested. And then lastly is Bo Allen. Didn't cite him at all in the first half, to be honest. He was a guy that I know a lot of us were really banking on early, in the sense of it being him and then the bomber pair of Pryor and Reed, and kind of looking to have 2, if not all 3 of them, and one of those defenders on ground, and then looking to a leak as our parachute options, let alone what else might come our way from a defensive rookie. Look, he's struggled a little bit in this game just to pick up the speed. Really low time on ground. Didn't get much of the ball either. It was a very low, from an AFL fantasy perspective, wasn't a massive scoring game either. So we'll give him some grace. But look, talented player, can play in a lot of positions, and just felt a little bit lost in moments in this game. He'll be better for the run without any questions about it. He'll get plenty of opportunities. But to me, I don't think I could justify starting him, given the likes of Pryor, given Reed, given Leak and what they popped. I think I'm a bit happier to trade into him rather than start with him. But with DPP and with pretty decent job security, he's not someone to fade interest in entirely. I just think others have moved ahead of him. But do you agree or disagree on my take about this Eagles and Roos game? If you're watching this on YouTube, comment below and let me know your thoughts on this game. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like if you haven't already done so. We're so thankful for you for watching this episode. If you haven't checked us out as an audio podcast, we've been there for years. We only just decided to get into YouTube over the last year or so. Make sure if you haven't subscribed, we've got us there on whatever audio podcast platform you like to listen to. Search for the Coaches Panel. We are there. Subscribe. Give us a 5-star rating. And inside the description of this episode is where you can get in touch with us across social media. All the handles are there. You can get your hands on some Coaches Panel merch, and you can become a Patreon, Breakout, Premium, and also the Cash Cow tiers. You can get involved in them. If you're a Breakout or a Premium tier supporter, you get our Keeper rankings kicked in as one of the value buys that get you into that tier. But if you don't want to do that, you just want the rankings and nothing else, you can jump into the Patreon shop and get your hands on them while you're there. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in. One more review to go, and then we turn very quickly our attention to opening round. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back with you again real soon with our final Community Series wrap-up.